Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Accounting for Impact. This is our third event of the year. And the usual, so some of you have come to the event before. We have a total of 1 hour, and we have a wonderful guest speaker, but who will be introduced by one of my Accounting for Impact team members. We take turns to kind of suggest speakers, and today we're going to have Joel Bocello, who is with Accounting for Impact. We'll now take the floor in a few seconds to introduce our speaker, Jess Arbach. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name. Sorry for that. So yeah, I will come back later to kind of close the event and also make some announcements about Accounting for Impact. As a quick overview, those of you who are attending for the first time, Accounting for Impact is a network to kind of encourage and foster engagement and increase impact for accounting scholars and beyond, because we also cherish interdisciplinary research and work. So that's the purpose, and to try to get speakers to share their experiences, to give some maybe suggestions, inspiration. And this is what we're doing today with Jess. So Joelle, I'm gonna leave the floor to you for introducing her, and then also moderate, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Charles. So my name is Joel Bocello, and I'm the event coordinator and outreach at AFI, and I'm also an associate professor in management at the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University. So I'm very happy to introduce Jess Auerbach Jahijia, if I pronounce it correctly. And Jess and I have been in contact for quite a while now, and she's done tremendous work as an anthropologist working within a business school. So she brings that interdisciplinarity that we're often looking for and when we're trying to engage in impactful research. And so Jess did her PhD in anthropology at Stanford, and she's oh, can you hear me okay? All right. Yeah, I don't know if I was cutting off. So
come back.
Okay, great. Yeah. So great, thank you. So Jess has done tremendous work as an anthropologist, and not only within the business school, but also exploring really interesting topics such as deep sea communication lines. And so I will leave it to her to discuss the impact. So Jess, you'll have about 25 minutes, half an hour, after which we'll open up for a broader discussion with the participants in this room. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let me just share my slides. There we go. Okay, so thank you all so much for having me. It's a very interesting set of conversations to enter into, and I'm really glad to be here. For me, it would be really helpful if perhaps in the chat people could just write down, where you're coming from, and if I can, I'll kind of toggle between the two, because it's helpful to have some sense of the geographic spread of the audience, as you know, potentially, as well as the sort of themes that you're looking at. But you know, no stress. So in this image, you'll see the prison tower. The Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town is housed in a converted prison, which is always a very interesting space to start looking at, you know, capitalism and its discontents. Cape Town is one of the world's most unequal cities, but it's also a place that I think is a real microcosm of global dynamics on so many different levels. So I spent quite a bit of time in North America, and I remember crossing from, you know, San Diego to Tijuana in Mexico, and it feels very familiar in terms of the South African geographic space. We have global capitalism in one country, whereas typically the sort of divisions that shape our world order are kind of managed through international borders, like, you know, the Mediterranean region, North America, Latin America, Pacific Islands, Australasia, all of that kind of thing. So I'll speak to some of that in this talk. There we go. Okay, so just in terms of what I'm going to cover, I will speak a little bit about my background and positionality, because I think that is important, and kind of try to orientate the talk in a very particular way. It's nice reading where you're all at the same time. Thanks, guys. Then I'm going to share the basis for some of for today's talk. As Joel mentioned, My current work is mostly on digital communications and Africa's connectivity with the world, but I'm actually going to be looking at a set of different conversations that are an important background for almost everything that I do, which is around how we think about research partnerships and the different ways in which impact can be understood. I'm going to introduce some language around majority and minority world, which is my strong preference to global North and global South for reasons I'll explain. I want to look at university structures, and I'm assuming you are all in university structures. If you're not, no problem. A lot of this is relevant anyway. And then think about time and personal incentives. Last part is really moving to kind of how we shift our research practices, our partnerships, our accounting, our impact, and then sort of concluding with this question of how do we ask honest questions? How do we get to honest answers and then have honest impact? Now, I speak quite fast, so please just interrupt me if I am speaking too fast, and I will very, very happily slow down. You won't be the first. So thank you all. Okay. So just in terms of background and positionality, I was educated at the University of Cape Town. It's a complex institution in the South African space. For my undergrad, even more complex in my world was getting a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, where you tell a North American that and they're just like, oh, amazing. But in South Africa, it's quite a fraught thing to accept money from this kind of arch colonialist. And to go and study at Oxford, it opens a lot of doors, but it's not tricky. I mean, it's not uncomplicated. And that's been a very thought-provoking process, and I remain quite involved in kind of how you rethink things like the Rhodes Scholarship as a gift from Africa to the world, rather than the way it's often formulated, which is just a pile of money for people to study, and those from Africa must feel complicated about it because colonialism, hashtag, won't go into the details there, but it's a good conversation. After Oxford, I was fortunate to go to Stanford and do my PhD there. Totally different set of really important questions and conversations around technology that have led to my current work around digital integration, digital capabilities, the digital divide, all these sorts of things. And yeah, I mean, the sort of obvious points here that it matters, I think, where we speak from. I am white, neurodivergent, heterosexual, South African by choice. And I say South African by choice here simply because with the kinds of qualifications I have, the expectation was very much to not be in South Africa. The expectation was very much to go work at Harvard, work at, I don't know, top universities globally. But I feel very, very strongly that it is important to open up different kinds of dialogue on the continent and elsewhere. And I'm actually thrilled to see one of my students here as well, that we don't get anywhere if we kind of take a group of people and then force them to leave, partly structurally, which is part of this conversation, because sometimes it can be very frustrating being in a university in what I'll call the global South for now, or the majority world, because of the structures of global knowledge systems. But at the same time, if we don't have people willing to make those movements, you then land up in a kind of increasingly bifurcated knowledge order, which is really important when it comes to questions of impact. I'll just say that in terms of my teaching, my formal contracts have been in Angola, in Mauritius, in South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States. But I've guest lectured and consulted kind of globally with particularly an Africa focus, but certainly not exclusively. I started as an anthropologist. So Joel mentioned I'm at a business school now. My surprise, as much as anybody else's. First, I worked at a startup university in Mauritius. Then I worked as an anthropologist in a kind of small South African university, and then landed up being recruited into the business school. And it's been very, very interesting coming in as a social scientist and ethnographer to this kind of management space, and seeing a lot of things that are really fascinating culturally around knowledge structures. And I don't know if you're all in management, but it's something I'll speak to a little as well. And the focus is really on management partnerships. So these are some of the books I've done, typically ethnography, and then kind of thinking with representation, thinking with storytelling in a whole bunch of different ways. So this is an image that, Makweni, please forgive me because you've had to see before, but I use this image in a lot of my teaching. And a lot of my public lectures and so on. So some of you will look at this and say, what is it? You know, if we had more time, I'd ask you. Often get a kind of Rorschach blot response, a sort of butterfly psychosis, all sorts of interesting things. But if you haven't figured it out yet, what you're looking at is a map of the world. And what you see is Cape Town at the southern tip of Africa is on the top left in the corner. You have the black area is the Atlantic Ocean, with the South Atlantic at the top of the screen and the North Atlantic at the bottom. And that little kind of funny shape right in the bottom left is the United Kingdom there and Europe. And I start with this map as a kind of invitation to think about the world differently. So when I was in elementary school, I had this great geography teacher who pointed out, you know, a bunch of 10-year-olds in 1994, as we moved into the post-apartheid era, there's no such thing as north in space, as up or down in space. This becomes a convention of storytelling that was highly useful for Europeans during the colonial era, because when you put Europe on the top of the world, in a very subtle way, you send a message about what kinds of lives count, the sort of hierarchy of human experience in the kind of 1500s. To be on the top was to be close to God in this kind of structure of humanity, right? And of course, we need conventions and we need narratives that we all share. But there's something quite powerful about inverting the map and just saying what happens when you firstly prioritize oceans by making them black and points of connection, where you consider what it means to think from a place like Africa or Latin America when it's suddenly foregrounded in the map. What does that do to how we think about the world and about what knowledge is taken for granted and whose perspectives count and in what ways? And of course, this is important for accounting of our stories, accounting of history, and so on. So I just want to use that as an invitation to think in this talk slightly differently, to reorientate your perspective, and to kind of ask, well, what is taken for granted in the way that we think and operate in the world? So I'm basing this talk on, I guess, two concrete sets of research, as well as a sort of broad, call it like a 20-year grappling with what it means to have such unequal structures in global further education. I don't like higher education either, but we'll roll with it. So as I mentioned, you know, I'm based in Cape Town, world's most unequal city, but also a city that makes apparent global dynamics of capitalism and socialism. You know, it's not just about political ideology here, but really it's about equality, not only of resources, equality and access, but also of representation and inclusion, and who gets to be in what kinds of spaces in the world. And certainly in terms of academic systems, when we think about partnerships and we think about the ways in which we want to develop equitable academia, oftentimes our structural positioning, as well as our embodied positioning and personal kind of biases, lead to all kinds of important assumptions that often make it more difficult to really do the work that we want to do in the world. So there are two papers that I'm drawing on particularly. The first was written, I was joint first author with Christopher Trissos, and then we collaborated with Madusan Kati for a Nature, Ecology, and Evolution paper called Decoloniality and Anti-Oppressive Practices for a More Ethical Ecology. And what we're trying to think with there is just, well, if you're serious about rethinking knowledge structures in the globe, how do you do it properly? What are some of the ways that we can take some of the student movements that had come out of places like the University of Cape Town? Roads Must Fall is a hashtag if some of you are interested and aware of it. But these led into and contributed to conversations like Black Lives Matter, some of the conversations around indigeneity and First Peoples in Canada, for example. If we want to get this right, and like we all recognize the system's a bit flawed, what are some of the concrete things we might be able to do to make it better? So this is a paper that has had a kind of like surprising amount of impact. This is quite an old screenshot, so I think the numbers are even higher now, which is amazing. But I think why it's done so well is because we're saying we all get that there's a problem, but you can actually do a few things differently. The second paper is a more recent one that will come out in the research in the sociology of organizations in January, and again, co-authored with a bunch of important colleagues here. And what we're trying to do is look at this question of decoloniality, which I'll explain in a minute, in relation to the grand challenges of the world that we're in right now. And again, just saying, well, what do we need to do specifically in the field of management that might allow us to have more equitable research partnerships, more equitable engagements with one another, basically start taking knowledge seriously whilst recognizing that our knowledges are shaped by particular institutions. So just to clarify, those of you who are not familiar with the word decoloniality itself, I want to distinguish it from coloniality as a kind of process of colonizing a space, decolonization as a place of kind of like Trevor Noah's whole kind of they leave and then you're no longer colonized. But decoloniality is about saying, how do you undo the knowledge systems that lead to people voluntarily or structurally operating in places of unequal recognition of humanity? That's kind of what it is in its essence. So how do we undo knowledge structures and remake knowledge structures in a way that we open up what is knowable? And in the case of management, certainly that requires really looking at the knowledge system and the publication system that we're in, which is part of where I'll get to. Now, I'm using this screenshot, and forgive me because it's not actually reproduced with permission. It's a screenshot of somebody else who did it. At least it does have the source. So this is the image is a carbon emissions map, resizing territories according to carbon dioxide. But the point I want to make with this slide is, again, a question of language. So I really encourage students and colleagues, people here in South Africa, instead of using the term global south, which is quite negatively loaded for all sorts of different reasons, to use the term majority world, which is one that has come out of a whole history of scholarship, actually originating in photography. A Bangladeshi photographer kind of coined the term, Salim Assad. And the idea is that those of us in South Africa, we have a lot more in common with people in India, with people in the whole of Latin America, with people in the Pacific Islands, in terms of our structural experiences of everyday life, than we do with those in North America, Sweden, Europe, kind of wealthy parts of the world. And the reason for that is because we only have one planet. And if we say that everybody needs to aspire to the living standards of Sweden, we are actually committing a kind of deep moral fallacy, because the globe doesn't have the resources for everybody to live in the way that people in Sweden, and nothing against the Swedes here, it's just an example, right? I'm trying not to use Canada because York University is hosting me. But if we look at kind of the limitations of what the world's resources are, it's not actually possible with this world and these technologies for everybody to live at the level that people live in Europe, North America, wealthy countries. Whereas we have a lot more in common with those who live in under-resourced ways. And the thing is, again, when we use this term majority world, we remember that despite the fact that theory and academic scholarship overwhelmingly originates in well-resourced countries that tend to largely overlook the scholarship that is produced by the majority, the experiences that we're highlighting when we look at development, or we look at the informal economy, some of Joel's work really speaks to these themes. What does it mean to kind of trade in township spaces, for example? When we look at these kinds of questions, again, the experience in South Africa is actually applicable to far more people than the experience might be of looking at like the banking sector in Switzerland. So I'm going to use this language, and I invite you to think with me in that way as well, because it's an important sort of contributor. The second thing that I think is really, really important is to look at university structures at all sorts of levels. So I've put that FT50 there. Those of you in management will recognize immediately that global business schools, well, business schools globally, are ranked largely by the ability of academic faculty to publish in a very limited set of journals that are selected and reviewed by the Financial Times, you know, the kind of wholly North American institution. And I like the Financial Times, I have no problem with them specifically. But what it means is that there is a very particular theoretical, methodological and personal networks incentive structure to produce knowledge that conforms to very particular ways of articulation. That comes to philosophy, that comes to the simple structures of arguments, it comes to language, to the predominance of English. I mean, we can look at French, Portuguese, we can also look at non-colonial language systems. But basically, if you want to be taken seriously in a business school, one way or another, you've got to engage with the Financial Times list, which means that a whole lot of knowledge that is really important and really completely invisible. And this matters partly because of what it does to global rankings, but it also matters because for scholars, and Joel, forgive me, but I'll use him as an example. Somebody like Joel's an associate professor. I presume one day he wants to be like a big full professor, like we all do. But to do that, you have to play a particular academic game, which requires publishing in particular ways. It requires reaching certain metrics of a university that include things like first authorship, that don't include the development or the public of global partnerships that really enable equality in the research relationship, because the whole structure of a university is designed on is based on the assumption that a few clever experts will dominate certain knowledge fields. And when we look at hiring, when we look at promotion, when we look at publication, when we look at what content is taught to students, we see that there's a very particular replication of a global knowledge order that is continually reinscribed on the world. And what we're seeing now is a very interesting rise of Chinese universities, Chinese knowledge structures, which I think over the next 50 years are going to challenge and kind of upset some of this dynamic in interesting ways. And, the Shanghai things. But either way, you've got a performativity of knowledge structures that entails particular practices that are not always conducive to equitable knowledge relationships. And then the third thing is time and personal incentive. So, it's a silly image. I was just trying to find an image of somebody juggling too fast. And the fact that it came from real estate kind of made me laugh. But the point is that all of us in these academic knowledge systems and teaching systems are, of course, human beings who have to figure out a whole bunch of different priorities. Partly we're looking to our students and what are the needs of our students. Partly we're looking to kind of professional career trajectories, promotion, those sorts of things. Partly we're looking to the kind of balance that we might need in our lives. And what you see globally is that, particularly at research-intensive universities in the minority world, you have a lot of money, you have very small students, student populations, and so a class might be 20 people versus at the University of Cape Town, which is a highly privileged university in our current space. I would have a class of 35 or maybe 50 versus my previous university where I had a class of 800 or 900. And depending on what your different commitments are, what the incentives are, what the requirements of the university are, that really shapes how you go about publishing, how you go about engaging in what we might call the work of public intellectuals, how you might go about building partnerships, because oftentimes the assumption from the minority world is that majority world partners are there for data collection because they have access to, the townships, for example. So townships are kind of low-income communities in South Africa. And I recently had an unnamed London-based university ask me if my students at UCT could be the data collectors for their students in the same named program to do their work while they were doing some kind of local collection. They were having a study tour to South Africa. And I had to say to them, look, I'm really sorry, but most of my students firstly didn't grow up in townships. They're the bougie middle class who can afford the fees of the top university on the continent. So whilst we do have some students who come from low income backgrounds, a lot of the students here actually wouldn't be able to do that work anyway and probably shouldn't. But there's also a whole set of expectations in that we would like to be writing the research questions. What is it about the global world order that makes it entirely acceptable for many of us to kind of say, well, 30 Canadian students are coming here and they're going to spend some time gathering data and then they're going to go write something about South Africa. Whereas if I wanted to send my whole class to Canada, or I'll give the example of Switzerland here, I would really like to send my whole class to go and study the informal economy or the ways in which economic structures of Swiss banking operate, because it's really interesting when you start looking at the banking sector in Switzerland versus a country like Nigeria, for example. But it would be absolutely impossible because of currency exchange, because of passport parity, and the fact that most of my students would not be able to get visas to Switzerland even in the best of times. So you have this incredible kind of disparity in the global knowledge structure. That means that certain voices are again and again and again prioritized, and that the incentives for academics and those who are the gatekeepers of knowledge don't allow for us to say, well, instead of being the first author on a fancy paper, I'm going to ensure that 3 students from Nigeria make it to Switzerland for 3 weeks. You know, you're not going to get promoted on those grounds. There's a lot of data I have informally and formally that can speak to those challenges in knowledge partnerships. Now, I want to get to the shifts. I've only got 8 minutes left, so I'll be fairly quick. The first set of shifts that I want to speak to comes from ecology, but again is broadly applicable to many different fields. And I think it's worth saying that this paper came out of experimental teaching we were doing at a startup university in Mauritius with an entirely Pan-African student base, where this was 2017, sorry. And Rhodes Must Fall had just happened. There were huge contestation around social science curricula, global curricula. And we said, okay, we're starting a new university. It unfortunately didn't last very long, but what are we gonna do differently? And so we made a set of commitments that then went viral. This piece got about 1 million hits worldwide, which was really interesting. And some of those then got formally incorporated into this conversation about decoloniality and ecology specifically. And the steps that we started with were just this question of like, how do you understand your mind? And, you know, what is your global north? What is your up? What is your down? How do you understand where your knowledge comes from, the foundations of it, and then how do you expand that? How do we ensure that students know the history, not only of kind of geopolitical events, but also of knowledge, of the systems that we're in, of who taught whom, and why we take certain kinds of knowledge structures for granted? We then need to really think about decolonizing access to data and to sources, because oftentimes, specifically with unequal currency variation in the world, it is impossible for us to all access the same information equally. We then need to think about expertise. And again, whose kind of knowledge counts? Is it PhD from Harvard, or is it a lifetime of experience navigating a complex multivariate economy, for example? And then really speaking to the importance of working in teams that include a multitude of different perspectives really allow us to kind of expand what we know and how we know by doing the complicated work of saying, okay, I see that this person has a different racial background, lives in a different country. You know, for me, it's often, oh my goodness, I can't be available for your meetings because I actually have too many students, my teaching load is too high, whatever it is. But how do we manage to start working in inclusive teams that genuinely do expand who's in the room? When we think about doing this in terms of partnerships and management in particular, we found that there's quite a lot of resistance to the idea of decoloniality in management itself, mainstream management. I don't know what that means, but it's definitely FTE top 50. So when I was hired at the GSB, I'll say with that same upside down map and all of those kinds of things, and pretty clear who I was and what I was bringing in. And in one of my first meetings, they did say, like, calm down on the decoloniality stuff. It's not going to fly here. And the reason that it doesn't fly in management so well is because really what we're looking at is this question of kind of, if we expand the pie, does the pie get smaller for the people who've historically had quite a lot of privilege? And that might be like home ownership in Cape Town for white people, or it might be who gets to publish in the FD top 50 in all sorts of interesting ways. But then there are other ways to have these conversations. And of course, decoloniality itself is kind of the latest language for conversations that have been going on for the last 500 years about global equality and kind of what globalization looks like and how we all orientate it. Anyway, in the end, the decision for this particular paper was to place the conversations around decoloniality into a framework of grand challenges, because grand challenges, I'm sure many of you know, much more palatable for various reasons. There are these huge challenges that we have to solve as a globe, otherwise we're going to have lots of problems. So fine, grand challenges, decoloniality and management scholarship. This is the sort of process of the paper that we've written. It's been a nice combination of authors, people based in Europe, and then myself and Letonolo from here. And what we've been looking at and kind of arguing for is a sort of tiered acknowledgement, firstly, of how we all fit in the knowledge structures and how you then build viable partnerships. So I don't particularly like the graphs that we're often made to use, because I just don't think that everything can be quantified. But what we say is, let's start with an acknowledgement of ignorance. Now, I am as ignorant of what it means to work at York University as somebody might be of what it means to work at UCT. So it's by no means a kind of like the global north is ignorant of the global south, majority, minority, you know, all of that. We are all ignorant of one another because that's the reality of being human. We know about our worlds. So how do we then expand our knowledge towards a genuine awareness of the structure as well as the lived reality that colleagues, would-be participants in partnerships, people who we are accounting for in the broadest sense, or accounting with, are in some way genuinely included in that space. Once you've got that awareness and you have a better sense of what questions might be asked, what the limitations of our knowledge is, we can then move towards a situation of integrating different knowledge experiences and different life experiences. And we say that, you know, it's not quite as simple as go from the left to the right, but it's the move we want to see. Once you've integrated those knowledge systems and really been able to understand, you know, how does the Nigerian banking system speak to the Swiss banking system? What are the ways in which we could understand legality and illegality in those two examples? Then we start integrating them and saying, okay, so if we want global knowledge, we've got to include both. And we've got to say that if you're speaking about the global financial system, Lagos is as interesting as Basel, for example, in this conversation. And then sometimes there is a need for elevation. And because the global academic order is dominated by Stanford PhDs and whiteness, you know, and the kind of all the things that represents in the history of the world, we then have to say sometimes we actually do need to be able to elevate other voices and consciously think of ways where instead of constantly perpetuating the status quo, we open up a series of kind of conversations, put other people's voices ahead of our own, and actually get, you know, create incentives for people to do that so that we start genuinely seeing a shift in what counts as knowledge and what doesn't. So I've got 2 minutes left. Joel has kindly said I can go 1 minute over time, but I'm nearly done. So I want to say, you know, when we come to think of accounting for impact in partnerships, I don't know what is meant by accounting really in this case. I'm not sure if you're all a bunch of kind of quant people sitting with ledgers and doing actual accounting, or if there's more of a sense of this as a much broader conversation around how we measure value. But, you know, this truism that you hear in all sorts of different ways, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. How do we think about that in terms of global knowledge structures, and how does that inform our ability to impact partnerships? So what I want to suggest is that all this becomes a lot easier if we just name the academy for what it is, and we say that honest questions, you know, let's really say, well, why am I doing this research? Why am I building this partnership? Sometimes the answer is quite simple. It's because I'm an associate professor and I want to be a full professor one day, and I need to jump through these hoops for the university to give me this. Or I'm a PhD student, and, you know, in my case, I wanted to include a whole lot of literature from Brazil, and I was told, look, nobody on your PhD committee speaks Portuguese. So if you include all this literature, we're all just going to ignore it and focus on whether or not you have actually spoken to our North American colleagues or not, you know, and that was really what I got told in the practice. So I included the Brazilian stuff, but it wasn't seen as that important because I needed to get a PhD that Stanford, not the University of Rio de Janeiro, had validated. And once you start being honest about those things, then I think it's really a lot easier to have honest impact. And some of the impact we want is really to change the global system. and some of the impact we want is perhaps a little self-oriented. And the same goes for people in the majority world who might be asked to collect data, because sometimes it's really annoying to have to do data collection. But if somebody pays me properly for it, in dollars preferably, that go a long way, sometimes it's worth just doing that work. And I might ask my students, who'd like to earn $100 might not be much in Canada, but it's a huge amount here. If I say to a student who wants to earn this work, this amount of money for doing some simple data collection in a township, there's going to be a bunch of people who are like, sure, that sounds great because I'm getting paid properly for it. But that's not an equitable research partnership. That's paying somebody for their work. And so in this sense, there's a lot of pushback against extractive research, which I fully agree with. And I hate being asked to be the global South partner, all sorts of problems with it. But sometimes there isn't time for genuine partnerships, because genuine partnerships take time and energy. Sometimes research is extractive because of the global visa system. We can't even get participation in conferences half the time because we can't attend them from here. So sometimes it happens, but then at least pay people, and at least don't claim to have global to be able to make global epistemic suggestions or theoretical interventions, when actually we're speaking about highly localized knowledge systems that are largely based out of particular paradigms from Europe and North America. When we move towards genuine partnerships, I think it's really critical that partners are included at all stages, particularly conceptualizing the research questions, and kind of imagining what the research project looks like to begin with. Because if somebody says, here's my project, can you be the majority world partner? But they've got the project already, it's automatically not going to be a project, or almost always not going to be a project that is necessarily the most appropriate to localized needs or majority world questions and driving forces. So if there's a desire to have genuine impactful, inclusive partnerships, it's absolutely critical that at the moment of conceptualization and research question development, partners are brought in, not after the fact. And my main point here is that there's no shortcut for time. This is expensive, careful work that requires long-term commitments. And I say here, I'd even advocate for love, and love is a forbidden word in academia. But what I'm getting to with that is that when you know a place, when you know people, when you actually care what happens to your collaborators over the course, not just of 6 months, but over the course of a kind of lifetime of research, you then start making decisions that are necessarily much more inclusive, account for far more dimensions of research practices and career development, and therefore often have much higher impact on a whole lot of different levels. So it might mean enabling somebody to become a kind of first author on a paper. It might mean getting people published in certain ways. It might mean publishing the outcomes of certain products in a variety of different spaces, not only global North journals, minority world journals that are paywalled and usually completely inaccessible for others. So I think that I'd love to have a discussion. Sorry, my name is impossible to spell, but you can find me on LinkedIn. And thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be able to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jess. That gives us a lot of food for thought and basis for discussion. So, and in answer to your question, I think the crowd here is definitely not just quant-oriented scholars, accounting scholars.
Sorry, I wasn't sure.
Range of people. Yeah, and you take a much broader range and broader perspective on accounting. So, so I think I have personally have a few questions, but I think we'll leave it firstly to the audience to see if anyone would like to open the floor with some discussions, with some questions or comments. Jaromir, go ahead.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Hello. Thanks a lot, just for the wonderful talk. Could you maybe, so I'm from Hamburg, Helmut Schmidt University, Department for Management Control. And do you have some examples how the division of labor could work in a more participatory relationship, so a non-extractive way of research? Because it's still a form of division of labor, and we have a known project with a strong interventionist branch in it, but it's still not so easy to navigate, to find a good sort of, who does what is the role of the researchers, what is the role of the practitioners, even if we aim to have it in a very participative way.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. And I really acknowledge this can be quite difficult, especially when you're starting without knowing a space necessarily that well. So what I'm imagining is that kind of somebody in Hamburg is going to a low resource country, so correct me if that's not the scenario. I mean, a couple of things I think are important. The first is again always to say, well, is it possible to include local experts in the project conceptualization stage to begin with? So a lot of times we see people find me online all the time because of the Stanford thing. I'm legible in a way that other colleagues might not be legible, which means that my expertise is often recognized quite quickly. Whereas somebody with a PhD from the University of Zimbabwe or from UNISA or many other places might not automatically come to the top of the pile in terms of who gets seen. But I think it's really important that whichever country or context or space one is thinking of engaging with, you say, well, who are the local experts? Who are the people who've been walking this journey? And then sort of put it as a question of saying, we are thinking of doing something in this space. Would you be willing to kind of get involved early? A lot of it does depend on what's trying to be achieved. Is it because oftentimes there's a little bit of a sense of we in the minority world are going to teach you in the majority world how to be like us. Now, I'm not in any way saying that's what's going on with you, but the perception is often that the minority world will provide solutions that the majority world must follow. And sometimes that can feel, I think, quite frustrating because usually those solutions don't work in a global world order, which relies on the status quo for the kind of current situation to continue. So something like, there's no point talking research equity if we hold all our conferences in venues that most of the people participating can't get visas to. Very simple example. So depending on what's trying to be achieved, I think the question is, how do you include local actors? How do you frame the questions? And then how do you listen to one another based on what are potentially quite different views of the world to begin with? And I think this means having quite sincere and quite vulnerable conversations early on about race, about positionality, sometimes about gender, about training, because we all come with such different kind of training trajectories in our careers. And again, like it's not always possible to do everything equitably. But I think it's useful to say, well, my expertise is this and your expertise is this, and this is how it's going to speak to the project. And then the last thing is just around outcomes. So for many people, and I'll include myself in this, a top peer-reviewed journal is very much a good outcome. But for many other people, a top peer-reviewed journal means absolutely nothing. And so the question is, well, did this research on water systems, did it actually get anybody water? Did it actually do anything to improve the situation that many of us are living in? And if not, okay, but could we add a dimension to the research project that enables some kind of impact there? And that, again, is something that requires conversations with university structures because of incentives and funding. So it's systemic, but it's also localized, and obviously a much longer conversation. I hope I've briefly answered. What is a great question.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jess. Would anyone else have questions? If you please raise your hand. Charles? Yep.
Yes, thank you, Jess. But this is exactly the spirit of what we want to do here at Content for Impact, and you shared really good insights on the very obviously relevant topic. And I'm going to ask a question more from a or maybe on behalf of many people who wonder, and we got that kind of questions whenever we share that, okay, after the top tier journal publication, then we have to do more. Of course, this is what, and then the question we often get, and like to get inside, is, okay, but this requires more time, more work, more resources, and it doesn't really count because that's not what our job description or universities are asking us to do, is go to the next paper. And of course, at AFI, that's what we're going against that. So I don't know if you, from a personal experience, I know each institution is different, each country is different, but from your take, how do we convince people that you should do more than just publishing in top tier journals?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question, and thanks for that. So I hope I got to a little bit of it just in saying that the issue is often the university structures. So I don't want to say like everybody in the school is doing bad work. You know, if Jeremy is doing a collaboration and it's not equal, like bad Jeremy, and nothing at all like that, because I recognize we are all in structures that incentivize certain things. But firstly, what's important is to recognize that, you know, until I joined the business school here, which happens to be triple crown accredited, I never even heard of these top 50 journals. You know, like they're not outside of management science. Nobody cares about these top journals. And so I'm working on a paper which I will try to publish in a top journal on like this weird object fetish of these top journals, because it's such a strange cultural phenomenon. But it is a phenomenon that shapes our lives, and it shapes the lives of many, many people. So if we're serious about doing impact, we then have to go to the universities and say, well, if you want us to have an impact in the Sustainable Development Goals, you want to show that, you know, Hamburg or Berlin or Toronto or York, whatever it is a global institution, but you're not giving incentives to your faculty to actually do work that has global impact. This is a problem that has to be dealt with at the structural level of the university. So in the paper that we're writing for RSO, part of what we say is there's no point pretending to do any of this if you can't then renegotiate promotion criteria. And for example, putting an author from the majority world as first author, even if they haven't actually done all the writing that would be expected of a first authorship publication, that should count for your promotion, because what you've done is you've invested in talent, you've invested in perspective, you've mentored somebody in this particular cultural practice of the top 50 journals. And that conversation, it has to happen at the university level rather than at the individual academic level, because I think it is totally unfair to put this demand on global North minority world academics. But it's equally impossible to put the demand to publish in the top 50 on people in the majority world for whom these journals don't actually do any good whatsoever, and who really don't care about them because they have no impact in their lives. It's completely ludicrous to say to somebody at the University of Zimbabwe, for example, you must be publishing in the top 50, when that person isn't getting enough salary to be able to pay their basic living expenses, and therefore has to consult for the UN on the side rather than doing the enormous amount of kind of unpaid labor that is required to publish in a top journal, particularly when you start considering the fact that the knowledge foundation of the top 50 journals is very limited. I mean, it doesn't include most of the world, theoretically, linguistically, culturally. And I went to a workshop of kind of how to publish in the top 50 journals, where one of the editors of AOM said, look, 70% of our journal is reserved for our colleagues in North America because otherwise they won't get tenure. And we can't do that to our colleagues. So the rest of the world, you're competing for 30% of publication space. And like they've never published, I forget which journal, but it's several of the top ones have never published anything by somebody based at an African institution, which speaks to all kinds of disciplinary and knowledge bias. And I think these conversations have to be had at the level of promotion, but also at the level of journal editorial and inclusion. So I hope that answers a bit there. It was a really critical question.
Thanks, Charles. Do we have any other questions? Any comments? Jess, I have a question for you too. I like the distinction that you made between decolonialism and decoloniality, and I think part of the push, I think, at many top journals and associations within management, but also accounting, marketing, et cetera, is to kind of bring Africa in. I see this term used quite often, that you bring Africa into these conversations, and when it comes to management journals or publications, it's bring African scholars into it. And I think that is kind of like perpetuating the decoloniality in some sense, because it's bringing them into an existing, like, as you use the term, knowledge structure, rather than engaging on their own terms. So I'm curious about what do you see in the African universities as being like alternatives to this? Or because I think one of the reasons why we have this structure where publications and citations count is because it's easier to compare amongst different universities, and it makes those different institutions commensurable in terms of their outputs. And so I think that's kind of, partially the explanation for it too. But in your experience and your exposure to universities, I guess, across the world, whether in South America and Africa, what have you seen as kind of being alternatives or potential ways we can get out of this situation, if I can pose it that way?
No, thanks, John. It's obviously a complicated question, and I think it's linked to what the other two questions were also asking around this. Part of this is the incentive systems are so deeply embedded in the kind of the institutions that have dominated and have shaped the field of management practice. So I think the answer has a few levels. I mean, one of them is you have to change the incentives in the kind of mainstream management practice. Another thing is then to say, well, how do we compare actually? Because if I take the University of Cachavallabuila in Angola, where I used to teach, like nobody can access the top 50 journals because they're behind paywalls. And so they literally, those journals don't exist, which means that those journals have done nothing to help anybody understand the really fascinating complexities of the Angolan economy. So if you wanted to sort of say, well, how do we do knowledge practice? I think a large part of it comes to saying, well, we want to publish in these journals because that's what's good for us. But in the same time, we're going to think about what sort of knowledge instruments can be developed from this work at the same time that are actually likely to have an impact on, on the Angolan economy, on improving lived realities in everybody's lives. And, both of those processes have to happen simultaneously. Are we ever going to make Cachavallabuila visible to those in the minority world as an equal institution? Probably not. And the reason for that is simple money. So again, like basic accounting. Stanford's operating budget was $4.5 billion when I was there in 2014 and doing my research in Angola. $4.5 billion is larger than the GDP of something like a third of African economies. So we simply don't have equal money to be able to invest in equal structures of knowledge production. And I just think like pretending that just because we all have access to Google Scholar profiles suddenly equalizes the world knowledge structure is a really unfortunate kind of lie that many people tell themselves, because the foundations and the operating conditions and the teaching realities are so different in these different spaces that really the only people who can compare the institutional profiles and experiences are those who are operating out of similar circumstances. So in addition to this, as anyone who's tried to publish in a top 50 journal knows, and I'm now getting some experience of, a lot of getting published in those spaces is proving that you've mastered the work of the people who are the gatekeepers. And if that work is completely irrelevant for you, why on earth would you be bothered? And I'm feeling this at the moment, there's a lot of pressure on me to publish in these top 50 journals. But a lot of the time I read the work and just go like, I don't care, because this conversation has nothing to do with me. I'm never going to be taken seriously because I'm not going to spend my whole life sucking up to the editors of AOM or whatever it is. But oftentimes that's what actually has to happen at conferences, assuming you can even get to the conference. And again, this visa question is absolutely critical, visas and who's able to travel where to be able to network. Because so much of it is, the pretense is that it's all based on the strength of theory and knowledge. But in reality, it's actually based on direct personal networks and who's willing to advise who's willing to give an informal kind of, look out for this bright student sort of method. And now again, if this were happening in Angola, it would be called corruption, right? There's a whole sort of literature around the traffic of influence that when it happens in a poor country and people give support and give tips and support one another kind of informally, then it's corruption. Whereas when it happens at the editorial board of a top journal, this would be knowledge gatekeeping. And that's the problem, is that the system is just so completely skewed. But if we call it what it is, which is what I'm trying to do a little bit now, I think that's the first step in actually moving the conversation.
Thanks, Jess. Charles?
Yeah, I was going to say something a bit different, but your bribery potential labeling reminded me of a story, quick story. The young daughter of a colleague of mine back then, she went to a conference and she saw all these people sucking up to those editors. And then she realized that oh, this editor or this man is the king, and then this other guy is the prince. So it says it all. Like even a kid could see the dynamics of a conference where people were talking to editors. They were not even FT50 journal editors, but they were still very good top journal editors in the field. And so that reminded me that it's so obvious. Now, what I was gonna say is, and by the way, for FT50, I do have some data that show that some of the impact of these FT50 journals papers are close to zero. So just to say that even the academic citation is pretty bad. Now, I was gonna say is the more comment about the, because you're obviously based in Africa, and I have a colleague, and Joanne knows her too, that when we talked about that a few years ago, she said, well, I feel so bad. I go to do ethnographic fieldwork in Africa, and then it takes years to publish that research, and then it doesn't really bring anything to the community. And so she was telling me that she was making, and I believe her, like drastic efforts to bring it to them, not so much as a consulting representation, but just like give it back to the community. Because a lot of things that we see is that we go there, and the global North scholars is kind of extracting the data, getting the publications and the bonuses, and then that's it. It almost never goes back to them. And it's pretty bad, right? I mean, it's another form of dominant colonialism where you go, okay, let me go to your backyard here. Let me interview a bunch of people from your community. Let me publish my 5 papers in the 50 journals. But then, what do these people get out of the research, right? That's another big concern that we should be aware of. So it struck me when she mentioned that. So that's just a comment to add to your site. Those thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks. And I mean, I'd say like I'm with you that it can be difficult to kind of give back and figure out how to do things. But for example, it was non-negotiable for me that my contracts I published with the University of Toronto Press for my first book. And in that contract, I kept the rights to publish in Portuguese, and I made sure that the book was available open access in Portuguese in Angola. Now, that's a start. And another thing is then saying, well, make sure that every time we go to a country to do data collection, you collaborate with a local partner who you then include in your publication process as a co-author. And so Lehlonolo in this case is actually my PhD student, Lehlonolo Kekana. He's one of the authors on the RSO paper. Now, he wouldn't be at all embarrassed with me saying this, that he didn't do very much on the paper because he's young and inexperienced and has come out of a totally different epistemic training. But what he got the exposure to how you do this kind of publication process. And that for me is an investment in ensuring that there are more and more people who know how this game works and who are then potentially empowered to be able to go and contribute to it in critical ways. And I don't see why, especially in a discipline that allows co-publication, it's so easy to ensure that people like local experts and use the local universities. There's always going to be somebody who's keen to publish with you if they're given credit. And an opportunity to then say, well, we're going to be doing this, and this is how we're going to do it. And then maybe like I need to go on your radio station, so I do a lot of work with media. Sometimes it's just easier to go and talk on national radio about the impact of the research you're doing because more people will hear it and more people will work with it. And so making those commitments as well to say, it's not just on the kind of majority world scholar who now needs to get mentored. Maybe I need to be mentored in oral storytelling to be able to explain why my work even matters in the first place. Like, why am I even doing this? And if you can have that kind of multi-directionality, here's this guy from Canada, here's this guy from Germany who's busy making this contribution. This is what they're doing in our country. This is why they're interviewing backyard dwellers. Then it also changes the receptivity of people towards researchers. And sometimes there's a real sense of kind of like research fatigue. Like every South African township has an American anthropologist living in it. It's kind of like a running joke. And that the white people you see in townships are always anthropologists from North America. That's kind of sad, you sort of want to have a situation where it's all a little bit more fluid and there's more of a sense of like equal collaboration. I do see Sedzani's question in the chat, just how to balance toning down on the decolonial work from your employer with trying to get into top journals. Sedzani, you are speaking to the story of my life at the moment. So, I mean, for myself, I've really felt that I'm not, look, I'm a white woman with a Stanford PhD. There's a limit to how decolonial I can also be. Like, and I really want to acknowledge that. Like, I'm not the forefront of certain kinds of conversations because I just don't think that's appropriate. But there's a compromise for me. I'm saying, well, I really think it's important to have these sorts of conversations around epistemic justice. And I think that there are certain ways in which it is possible to work with these journals and to also expand the pie of the journals. And some of that is just saying, well, what can I kind of call out and name about the knowledge system? And some of it is saying, what is the material, like something like the Capitalismo Salvaje or the how the Angolan informal economy works. That's stuff that I actually know better than many people working in top journals, right? And so in that sense, some of that stuff becomes publishable. I guess it's a bit of a balancing act, and it probably depends on my boss's mood. I'll be going like, we don't have a tenure structure. We have you become permanent, and that conversation's in 2 weeks' time for me. And hopefully you kind of play the game well enough. But it is also a question of moral choices and where you invest your energy, and who has the freedom to take those kinds of risks as well. But yeah, maybe something we can have a longer conversation about one day.
Thank you very much, Jess. I think we really appreciate your insights as someone who's coming into the business school and bringing like a lot of thought and a lot of reflection upon how to engage in more equal partnerships. So I'll leave it to Charles for the final word.
Well, final word is a big word. Just like to thank again Jess for coming in and share those very wonderful insights, very inspiring. This is exactly what we're looking for at Account for Impact. Thank you, Joelle, for suggesting that we invite her and moderating. So a couple of announcements. So for the summer, we will kind of take a break on events. And I know it's a bit restrictive because obviously it's an in-person event, but we will have our first in-person event of Account for Impact in Toronto on October 4th. We will send a massive email to invite. I know that obviously it's not an easy and just to travel, but if you are in the area or you're interested, you'll be welcome to join. And then we will have probably the last event of the year online will be November 22nd. Obviously, more details coming up. So that's pretty much the news, and we are always welcoming ideas, new members. I put some events, the events page of the Accounting for Impact's previous events. This event would also be posted there online. So keep following us, and then feel free to reach out. Thank you again for your participation, and have a wonderful day or evening or afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Jess.
Bye.
Thanks, Charles.